Each grave, each planted flag, each wreath holds its own story of a husband, a father or a son, a death that came too soon. The Ukrainian government venerates those killed in battle as heroes, but never lets on how many have died. Only the grieving know the true cost of war. Alexander commanded a reconnaissance unit operating behind enemy lines. His wife is expecting their second child, but his son will never know him because he was killed last month.
Йому вічна шана буде в наших серцях. Діти дуже скучають за ним, сумують. І ще не народжене. Ось в серпні буде хлопчик, у мене ще буде внучок. Він слід оставив на своїй землі. Ми будемо гордитися ним. Вічна пам'ять усім хлопцям, героям слава. Всім мамам здоров'я, щоб кріпилися, бо дуже тяжко.
The family tend the grave next to theirs, which contains the remains of a soldier who's not yet been identified. Concerned about the nation's morale, the Ukrainian authorities are reluctant to admit that even a successful counter-offensive will lead to heavy losses, and many thousands are likely to be injured too. Ukraine's prosthetic technicians are getting more practice than they ever wanted. The rehabilitation centre in Dnipro is one of 9 across the country, each already dealing with hundreds of men who've lost limbs and may need long-term support. Vasil's getting his prosthetic leg adjusted. He hopes to go back to the front line, maybe as a driver, despite the terror of the attack on the dugout where he was sleeping on Christmas night.
Услышал выстрелы, в общем, в ходе боя, и через тепловизор увидел 2 человек, начал с собой. Вот. В ходе боя бросили мне гранату под ногу, в общем. Вот. Уже после того, как оторвало ногу, я еще вел бой минут 5, наверное, и отстреливался, и гранаты бросал.
He thinks of his cousin, who's fighting in an enemy air defense unit. They haven't spoken since the Russian invasion of the Donbass in 2014.
Що відчуваю? Ненависть, наверное.
War has brought with it a new attitude to disability.
Якщо раніше люди ховали протези, і вони стіснялись, що вони на протезі і немає своєї ноги, наразі хлопці показують це. Вони не турбуються о цьому. І люди восприймають гідно, вони герої. Вони втратили ногу за те, що вони нашу батьківщину захищають. Так.
Безсовісне.
How to understand all this if you're only 8 and can't imagine losing a limb, let alone your life? But what Bogdan does understand is that his mother is always sad these days because his older brother Vitaly didn't come back from the war.
Людина з великої літери. Просто людина. Це серце. Я ж кажу, у нас просто забрали.
You must be very proud of him.
Да. Просто забрали землю з-під ног. Забрали землю. Дихання. Хотілося. Довго не вірила. Довго. І зараз не вірю. Що його немає поряд з нами.
The last video of Vitaly shows him smiling in the snow a few weeks before he was killed near Avdiivka in February.
Віталька, Матвій і Віка.
His son is just 16 months old. And all because Vladimir Putin says that Ukrainians need rescuing from a Nazi government.
Кому она нужна, эта война? Зачем? Ребят молодых улаживать. Зачем? Сколько гибнет? Через каждый двор плачет мама. Зачем? Зачем? Кому это надо? Мне она не нужна. Я могу размовлять и на российской, и на украинской. Где тут нацизм? Покажите, пожалуйста. Кто тут, ну?
During the long years of peace, the dead rested in the cemetery on the hill above the town of Pavlograd. Now there are new graves, Vitali and other young men taken by war. The sorrow of Olya and her sister is replicated across the land as hatred of the Russian invaders hardens, with the growing realization that by the time this ends, every Ukrainian family will be touched by grief. I wish I could go to Russia and report on the grieving mothers there. The last we heard, this was an American estimate, 200,000 Russian soldiers had been killed. But the Russian authorities won't let journalists in. They don't want us to report the war or the impact of the war. And the terrible thing is, it's not about equating both sides. But when it comes to the grief of a mother, it's just the same. And we're going to see a lot more of that before this war is over.
Lindsey, thanks very much for your moving report. Well, earlier I spoke to Alexandra Azharkina, Ukraine's Deputy Minister for Infrastructure, who was at the Foreign Affairs think tank here in London, Chatham House. That's ahead of a major reconstruction conference tomorrow. I began by asking her for her thoughts on the human cost of this war, which began 482 days ago.
It's a tragedy because we're losing the best women and men we have on the front line, and for sure because of the Russian attacks on the civilian infrastructure, we're losing children and civilians daily. Frankly speaking, no one could adapt to that. No one can evaluate the price. For sure, our job is to at least evaluate the damage Russia does to our infrastructure, to our economy. That's what we can count, and that counts already in hundreds of billions.
The amount of money you get from the international community, actually the amount of weapons that you get are also proportional to the success on the battlefield, your success. And at the moment, this summer offensive is not going very quickly, is it? Because the Russians have built all these lines of defense. Are you worried that it's going too slowly and it might lose you some of the pledges that you were hoping for?
Our ministry started to be responsible for the international logistics of the military support to Ukraine since the first days of the war. That makes us quite good in counting. And frankly speaking, we were quite shocked when we understood if we're taking the basic weapon systems, Russia has them in thousands, Ukraine has them in hundreds, but if we count separately different countries of Europe, it's only tens. That's quite striking. So for sure, it's a challenge. For sure, we need more weapons. For sure, it's difficult. For sure, it's costly. But we, frankly speaking, have not much chances, and we need to continue.
Last night, we saw that some critical infrastructure was hit in the city of Lviv in the west of Ukraine. And of course, critical infrastructure has been hit over and over again in this war. It seems to be a policy of the Russian war machine. How much money have you calculated, since you say you're good at numbers, how much money do you think you need in order to rebuild what has been destroyed?
So we are counting on the World Bank estimation. They're quite a pro on that, and for sure you probably also saw the numbers they're mentioning. It's around $400 billion already. But if we're focusing on the current needs, it's around $14 billion. And in the same time, we understand that Ukraine gonna be happy whatever it comes to the country. And the key question for us is to use those funds as efficient as possible.
And if the war drags on into later this year, perhaps into next year, perhaps even longer, will that make it more difficult for you to persuade big international donors to give money for reconstruction?
For sure, it's not an easy task, but we see the examples of the difficult wars around the world where the partners were consistent and were staying in the war conflict for years. That's not what we would like to. We really would like to have more weapons to seize this war now, to regain our sovereignty now.
Finally, what sustains the international effort, what sustains Ukrainians fighting this war on the ground, is the fundamental core injustice reflecting on the last year and a half, what for you has been the most shocking thing that you're still trying to get your head around?
Phew, there are so many of that, but frankly speaking, the Kakhovka Dam was a thing, and that was my personal paranoia since the first day of the war, when the Russians hit the dam in Kyiv region, just in the first days of the war. And every time you think that they did already the worst things, they're surprising us again and again. They damaged the nature, they damaged the industries. It's not only about the people, but about the life itself. And for sure, it also shows how neglected they are to the territories they occupied, to the Crimea they occupied earlier. I'm personally from Crimea. I grew up there. I'm a fifth generation born there. And I know that the only interest they have, they are the military interest.
Alexandra Zakhina, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.